everyone. Very happy to open the online policy exchange of Elnet for the first of the 2022 period. So welcome everyone. Without further ado, I'm gonna jump directly to the biography of our distinguished speaker for today. And then we're gonna, Jonathan, with your permission, just to jump directly to it. So Dr. Jonathan Schanzer is a Senior Vice President for Research at the FDD, not the FDA, the FDD, Foundation for Defense and Democracies. He oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. He is also on the leadership team of FDD's Center of Economic and Financial Power, a project on the use of financial and economic power as a tool of statecraft. In the past, Dr. Schanzer worked at the US Department of Treasury, mostly on terrorist financiers, and held additional positions at the Washington Institute and the Middle East Forum. Jonathan has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East, but most recently he published his fourth book on Gaza conflict, 2021, which we're going to mention throughout this event. So I will mention it also at the end of the event. His past books also dealt with major conflicts such as Hamas versus Fatah, Palestinian leadership, and Al-Qaeda group on affiliation and next-gen terror. Our speaker today is also invited often to speak before the Congress and international and local media, thanks to his frequent travels to the Middle East and language skills, besides of English, of Hebrew and Arabic. So Jonathan, please take 5 to 7 minutes of your introduction and share with us your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omri, and thank you, Elnet. Really, it's an honor to be with you. It's my first Zoom speech of 2022. I actually hope it's my last. I hope that we can all move to in person as soon as possible, although of course we're not sure exactly when that will take place, but it is an honor to be with you. I thought I would speak for just a few minutes about some of the observations that I made of the Biden administration and how it performed in the Middle East in 2021. This is, of course, a contentious topic, and given the very deep partisanship in the United States, I think probably anything that I say will be contested. Let me just say up front that FDD is a nonpartisan organization. We don't take Democratic or Republican positions. What I'll do today very briefly is just explain how I viewed specifically the conflict of May 2021 and perhaps a little bit of what happened before and what happened after. Look, I would say the upshot of the war itself was that Biden performed very well. I continue to hear, as I watched the conflict in Hebrew on the Israeli television channels, the word that I heard repeatedly was gibui, that the United States had Israel's back, and that Israel was able to conduct its operation. Of course, Israel never calls it a war, but Israel was able to conduct its operations with a free hand for really the majority of the conflict. But and by the way, that means that the United States was giving Israel cover at the United Nations. It was giving Israel cover in Congress and in the public, in the media itself. And so I would say that the Biden administration performed well and should be given a pat on the back. What was interesting to me, however, was what happened in the last 2 days of that conflict. And that's where the tone shifted quite a bit. I talk about this in my book. That was when we learned that Egypt had secured a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. And that was, of course, welcome news. I saw it first on Al Arabiya, and then I saw it also in the Israeli media. It was not widely reported here in the United States. Perhaps our media or our officials were waiting for the ceasefire to take hold. But we knew that there was going to be roughly 48 hours between the announcement of the ceasefire and the implementation. It was at that point that we began to see some troubling things coming out of the White House. Specifically, that was when Biden began to talk tough to Bibi Netanyahu, the former prime minister of Israel. The White House began to leak statements to the media. And I was actually speaking with some of the reporters who were trying to interpret what all this meant. But we began to hear stories about how Biden was, quote, done kidding around, and that he was trying to force Israel to end its operations. Here's the thing. Israel was already ending its operations. We already knew that there was a 48-hour window for the ceasefire to take place. The number of rockets firing out of Gaza had diminished significantly. The number of responses from Israel had also diminished significantly. And in my view, this was an attempt by the White House to placate what we describe here in the United States as the Squad. This is the progressive group of members of Congress that have been very anti-Israel in pretty much any manifestation, whether it comes to Hamas or Iran or any other topic for that matter. And so I saw some, I think, troubling political signs coming out of the administration. I will also note that there was perhaps one other thing. It was a misstep on the part of the administration, perhaps not done deliberately, but the decision to support the Palestinian elections. These are the elections that were slated to take place in April. It was going to include Hamas. Hamas, of course, is a terrorist organization here in the United States, as well as in a number of European capitals. But we have laws here in the US that would have mandated a cut in funding and a cut in recognition of the Palestinian Authority. This would have been a huge mistake. Nonetheless, the United States continued with this policy leading up to the conflict, and it was only at the very last minute that the United States was convinced, I believe, by Israel and perhaps some European capitals as well as some Arab capitals to cancel those elections. But in my view, it was the months leading up to it that gave Hamas a sense that it would be a legitimate partner in that government. And then when that was taken away from Hamas, that may have been the reason that Hamas decided to engage in violence in the way that it did. In other words, it could have been a political misstep on the part of the United States that led to the war in the first place. I don't think it was done intentionally, but it was still, I believe, a severe misstep, a severe mistake. Now, the last thing that I'll just note before we go to the conversation, Omri, is that the messaging coming out of the White House before the conflict, after the conflict, has been troubling in one very clear sense, and that is that the United States intends to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, I will say that, of course, that agreement has been controversial since it was announced back in 2015, and certainly since it was implemented, and then after the Trump administration withdrew from it. The Biden administration is eager to get back in, and we don't need to rehash or relitigate all of the controversy. What I can say for sure, though, is that if the United States does enter into the deal again, it will yield Iran significant sanctions relief. And that sanctions relief, the last time around, we weren't sure whether the money would reach the hands of some of Iran's proxies, including Hamas. I think today we can say with certainty that we can see those money flows, that we know that Hamas will be a beneficiary. And by the way, that would also include Hezbollah. It would include the Houthis. But in the case of Israel, what is, I think, most remarkable to me is that the United States, should we continue to pursue this line of policy, the United States could effectively be funding both sides of the next Gaza conflict. We're seeing tension right now between Hamas and Israel, and there's been clashes just over the weekend. But let's just be clear, the United States continues to support Israel militarily and economically. Of course, this is an important pillar of American foreign policy. But at the same time, should we enter back into that nuclear deal, we could see a situation whereby the United States is indirectly funding Hamas by way of Iran. And this is not a position that I think the United States should be in. We should have a position that is of greater clarity. And my hope, anyway, is that we see that clarity in 2022. I'll end it there. Thank you, Omri.
Thank you for this opening remarks. And I can tell you that not only that as an Israeli who lives in Israel, I can agree with you, obviously in the light of recent development in the region, that we saw Hamas stronghold in Lebanon, and obviously the proxy that lives in Lebanon through Iran. That's very interesting to hear. And I wanted to ask you a direct question. The topic of this conversation, and I just mentioned with your permission, 2 main points, is the Biden, the Squad, and the Americans' global role. And just to mention that this session is on record, as I mentioned in our email, but I just wanted to put it here as well. is America still has a global role in the region? And with your permission, if you can also refer to China, and of course, the big winter bear that aiming towards Ukraine as well. Of course, I'm talking about Russia, just about the region, because we hear a lot about the different conflicts or a second Cold War that we hear a lot recently, and I want to hear your thoughts about it, please.
Absolutely, and it's the right question to ask. It's what everyone is talking about here in the United States, and this is what we call great power competition, a growing competition between specifically China and the United States. With regard to Russia, there's no doubt that Russia still poses a threat to Ukraine, and perhaps to all of Europe. However, I would say that most of the analysts here in the United States refer to Russia as a weak power that is playing a strong hand. In other words, this is not a country that is engaging in great power or peer competition with the United States, but can still pose great challenges to America's allies, and this is certainly something to watch. And of course, we should also mention that Russia has significant cyber capabilities and influence operation capabilities that continue to pose a challenge to the US-led world order. But I would say that Russia probably plays a supporting role to countries like China. China poses a far greater threat, that you see China really trying to supplant the United States economically, politically, and diplomatically. This is taking place through various initiatives around the globe. When we talk about the One Belt, One Road initiative of investment in foreign countries, and the Middle East is certainly not immune to those investments. But of course, China is also trying to absorb or supplant the United States and in the international system, taking over the standard-setting bodies at the United Nations and elsewhere. So it's a major cause for concern. Now, specifically, Omri, I think the question leads us to what is China's role in the Middle East, and how does one interpret what's going on over there? Look, I would say this: that first, the U.S. did show leadership during the Gaza conflict, and that was a very positive thing. The negative was, of course, the withdrawal from Afghanistan that happened shortly thereafter. The cadence of the withdrawal, the order of the withdrawal was, I would say, the most problematic. The withdrawal of military troops before the removal of political personnel led to a disaster, which I think the United States is still trying to recover from. And of course, the very loss of a war that lasted as long as it did and that cost the United States as much blood and treasure as it did also created significant problems in terms of perception of the United States. The question is, does the United States still have deterrence in that part of the world? I think there's also a question, and by the way, I don't know if there is an answer to that question yet. There's also another question of whether the United States is willing to stay in the Middle East. There's a lot of talk right now from what we would describe as neo-isolationists. These are people that do not see the role of the United States enduring in the rest of the world, let alone the Middle East. We have people here talking about how we need to end forever wars. Well, that means getting out of Iraq. It means not engaging with Iran. It means getting out of Afghanistan. So there are real questions that remain right now for Israel, as well as a number of its Gulf allies, about whether the United States has the will to stay in the Middle East. And that's a question that I think will probably be answered in 2022.
Right, and you kind of slide into my next question regarding the U.S. role in the region, if at all, if it's relevant or not, but how a country like Israel can gain support. We just, recent Vienna talks about restraining Iran and her regional aggression towards not only about Israel, but aggression in the region. What do you think?
Look, I think the United States is not giving Israel a lot of room to maneuver when it comes to diplomacy. It's very clear that the U.S. is pursuing a return to the 2015 JCPOA, whether Israel likes it or not. And there has been a decision made on the part of both leaderships that there will not be public disagreements. There will not be public arguing in the way that we saw between Bibi and Obama, for example, in the early phases of that deal. The Bennett-Biden relationship is one where they are trying to keep their disagreements more quiet. However, I will say that I think there is a very strong possibility that the Israelis will continue to engage in what they call the war between wars, or campaign between wars, the milchama ben milchamot, the mabam, as you call it in Hebrew. The idea here is that Israel continues to carry out attacks against Iranian assets in places.
According to foreign press, I have to mention, Jonathan.
According to the foreign press, although some of it has been acknowledged by Israel itself, some of the IDF. And what we're talking about here is specifically attacks against Iranian assets in Syria, precision-guided munitions that are being transferred to Hezbollah in Lebanon by way of Syria. These are all targets that Israel has been hitting with some regularity, but it doesn't end there. And I talk about this quite a bit in my book. There's a long chapter on this. There are attacks that are taking place in the cyber realm against Iran's nuclear facilities. There are assassinations, of course, that we know of, where senior figures from the Iranian regime have been targeted, allegedly by the Israelis. Here it's foreign press. And we hear about, obviously, attacks against other officials. In fact, we heard about an al-Qaeda official that was targeted inside of Israel. There are attacks on the high seas off of the Gulf of Oman, in the Mediterranean. So this is an asymmetric campaign that is attributed to Israel, in some cases acknowledged by Israel. But what I believe is that we will continue to see this tempo of attacks that are taking place to weaken and erode Iranian capabilities, even as the United States engages in diplomacy, problematic diplomacy, I would add, with the Iranian regime.
Right, and I can tell you that it's not only felt in international media. When you go to the Israeli streets or even the European streets, it's not always felt. But this is something that we want to put on the table. And let me ask you a direct question, going back to the American administration on the benefit of Israel, of course, with the recent developments, the Biden administration or the Trump administration. And obviously, you already mentioned the JCPOA, but maybe you can also embed it what your think on the Vienna talks and the upcoming, maybe forming deal.
So look, on the question of the deal itself, it was obviously, from Israel's perspective, highly problematic. I think from the United States perspective, highly problematic. There was a 5-year deadline for the arms embargo, which is now, we're past it. And that meant that Iran could buy and sell weapons on the open market. Then at year 8 comes the ballistic missile restrictions. And then after that, all of the other sunset provisions come into place. And it's for this reason that, I think the critics of the deal rightly argue that it would yield Iran a legitimized nuclear program within 15 years, perhaps even less. And I think that is still those are the fatal flaws of the deal. The Trump administration, of course, wanted nothing to do with this deal. The former President Trump, criticized the Iran nuclear deal, I don't want to give anyone the sense that Trump read the deal from start to finish. I doubt that he did. I doubt that he read the text. But I think Trump understood the flaws of the deal. He understood the concerns of Israel. He understood the concerns of Saudi Arabia, the UAE. And in fact, I would say that his understanding of those concerns and his relationship with those countries likely led to the normalization agreements that we saw in 2020. And so I would say full credit to Trump for that. The problem, though, with Trump is that when he left the deal, there was nothing in place to put additional restrictions on Iran. Right. And this is exactly what the Biden administration is so concerned with right now. I would only just note here that, yes, the Trump administration left the deal hastily and left gaps. The thing is that the United States still has the power to impose crippling sanctions on Iran, to put significant pressure, what we call the maximum pressure campaign. That should be in place alongside any negotiation with Iran. So whatever we're seeing out of Vienna, which, by the way, doesn't look particularly positive right now, the United States looks overly eager and overly flexible. The Iranians look less flexible and less eager. That's not a good dynamic and will likely lead to concessions that Iran will pocket if, in fact, a deal is signed. But what the United States should be doing and still can do, and the Europeans can help in this regard, is placing sanctions, placing additional economic and political pressure on the Iranians to ensure that a good deal is reached. Not a weak deal, but a good deal. That should be the ultimate goal.
Of course, and we kind of going over the details almost every day here, trying to see where the involvements end and where the sanctions come in. And we saw also in the evening of the opening of the talks, the famous headline from the Iranian journalist about just do one mistake, Israel, and we can bomb actually a lot of places in Gaza. So I don't think the person who planned this map was so smart, but in generally, obviously there is a conflict. A lot of people address it as a Cold War, and thank you also for your notes. Because we don't have a lot of time, we want to reach the 1 hour mark after the entire conversation and also open the floor. I want to ask you, with your permission, a few questions about your book, your recent book, as we just mentioned. And if people don't see it right behind you, I also have a hard copy here as well. And you talk about two themes that I kind of directed myself towards, and I wanted to mention it and also to ask your opinion about it, maybe an extension. So you mentioned two interesting things: the collapse of peace, obviously in the region, and goes over the recent history of the Palestinian-Israeli relations. But I can ask you something like that: could Israel done anything different? I mean, especially in the past year. And the second question is, you're talking also about the regional peace beacons, which kind of contradict the last chapter. But I want also, because you partially mentioned it in your recent answer regarding the Abraham Accords, and obviously the Trump administration promoted it, but also obviously Biden administration and the Bennett administration also promoted it as well, as we saw the first foreign minister visiting Morocco for the first time. We saw the first visit of the Prime Minister Bennett, who went to the UAE recently. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about what is changing in the region and how it can impact not Iran this time, but the regional conflict in general.
So both excellent questions, and I'll try to perhaps answer them together. First, one of the things that I noted in the book, and that I continue to note every chance that I get, is that the Arab-Israeli conflict is shrinking. It is no longer the Arab-Israeli conflict that we knew from 1948 or 56 or 67 or 73, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very different Middle East now. I think Arab states are beginning to realize that Israel is the best enemy they ever had. That Israel is actually aligned with most of these regimes in the Arab world. Not all, of course, but many of them. Their antipathy for the Muslim Brotherhood and for Islamists, their desire for relative stability in the region, their alarm and concern over Iran. And so when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's much smaller than it used to be. I'm not even sure that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is what it used to be either. Of course, if you saw during the most recent round of violence, it was only the Gaza Strip, not the West Bank, that erupted. Now, of course, there were Arab Israelis that took to the streets, and we can also talk about that. That is not an easy topic to understand or unpack. But what I would just say is that the Palestinian issue is not quite what it used to be. We were not looking at an intifada that went across both territories, but rather a very specific territory that is Gaza, that is really, and I think this is the important point, it is sponsored by three primary powers: Iran, Qatar, and Turkey. They are the ones that are promoting Hamas, and they are the ones that are essentially allowing for this kind of violence to take place. And so what that means is that the conflict is shrinking. And we hear this a lot in the Israeli media. They talk about shrinking the conflict. It's already happening. And so the question then becomes what to do about it. Now, in the lead up to the Abraham Accords, there was a lot of talk about what Israel would do, what Israel could do in order to hasten the peace agreements with the Arab states, and also what Israel could do to please the Arab states in the Palestinian space. And this, I think, is really important to think about. There is, I think, the perspective of the Israeli leadership that they want to work from the top down. And what I mean by that is they want to engage with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan and any other, Jordan, Egypt. any other country that is willing to engage in normalization, the goal would be to engage and to try to make peace, and then to show the Palestinians that if they don't join this regional peace initiative, that they're going to be left out in the cold. Okay, that's the top-down approach. The bottom-up is for the Israelis to engage directly with the Palestinians, to make their lives easier, to find ways of allowing for better movement within the territories, to allow for more products and services to come in, better internet, better technology. Now, the question is, would that engender better relations with the Arab world? I think the answer is yes. But I think, by the way, both strategies make a lot of sense. And so top down and bottom up should be, in my view, done together. And this is, I think, a mistake. You ask about what mistakes Israel made. I think Israel should have done more from the bottom up while also pursuing the top down. I think there is still a lot of work to be done in both regards. Now, the only thing that I will say, and this is a big question mark for 2022, and the question is, how committed is the Biden administration to the Abraham Accords, to expanding the Abraham Accords, to ensure that Saudi Arabia joins, or Kuwait, or Qatar, or any of the other countries that are potential countries that could join? The question is, can the Biden administration engage? Now, one last thought. The European countries seem to be somewhat absent on this. They don't appear to be taking the lead. I believe that the Europeans have a lot to say in this regard. They have excellent relations specifically with the North African countries, but also with the Levant. These are still world leaders, Germany, France, etc. These are countries that should be engaging in trying to promote additional Abraham Accords, additional agreements and normalization. I'd like to see more of it. It's not only the Biden administration's responsibility.
I, of course, agree with you, but with your permission, before we're going to talk and discuss this dissonance, I want also to mention the dissonance that you portrayed in your book, the dissonance of Arab countries, or through the Abraham Accords, or through the normalization agreements, support Israel in some sort, but on the other hand, also, not banning Hezbollah or not banning Iran. So they're kind of supporting both sides to say, are there two sides? Are normalizations mean that you are against Iran or Hezbollah or whatever? Or you think that supporting Israel puts them in a difficult position? You mentioned the Arab conflict. To support Israel, we can go 50 years back with the Arab League, or 60 years back with the Arab League, mentioned the three no's: not supporting, not recognizing, and of course not involving in with Israel. So how do you see it now in these times with the Abraham Accords promotion? And you mentioned just Saudi in general, that is according again to allegedly or foreign press to also join the Abraham Accords very soon. So what do you think on that?
So look, the first thing to just say about the Abraham Accords was, I think, it was a recognition that the Palestinian cause may still be important to the Arab world, but it's not going to be the #1 issue any longer. In other words, it was a decision to deprioritize it. Maybe it's the second priority, or the third priority, or the fourth priority. It's not the first any longer. Okay, and that was, I think, a core component of the Abraham Accords, and it's a core facet of the changes that we're seeing in the region. Now, then I think the next question to ask is, what are the primary concerns? The primary concerns are the national security of these countries. And the national security relates back specifically to Iran. Iran is the foremost state sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East, and it is often the #1 country destabilizing the region, whether it's Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, or certainly in the Gaza Strip, perhaps in the West Bank and beyond. So this is, I think, a core concern. It was one of the core drivers of the Abraham Accords. I was critical in my book of the way in which a lot of the state-run media did not directly address Iran's role in the Gaza conflict. That it would be easy to criticize Hamas. Now, I will say that it's probably not as easy as it looks for me, because the images of Gaza getting bombed by a stronger power, Arabs suffering at the hands of what is a non-Arab power, these things I think probably did not sit well with Arab audiences. And so that may have explained some of the reticence. But this is, I think, one of the core challenges that still awaits the Abraham Accords countries, that they are going to have to take a stronger position. If they entered into these agreements, not just for economic benefit, not just to curry favor with the United States, if their goal was truly to strike a balance in the region against the hegemony or aspiring hegemony of Iran, then this was, I think, a missed opportunity. They didn't fail. I believe that the Abraham Accords passed an important test in the fact that they didn't collapse, but there is still much more work to be done in terms of challenging Iran.
Of course, we hear a lot of thoughts about why Arab countries are entering the accords, and we hear from obviously, as you mentioned, the economic benefits, but not only. We hear also about security and intelligence sharing. But let's wait and see that things are not open to the great public, also not to us. And before opening the floor to general questions, and we have a lot. Thanks to the great audience that we have here. It's a big audience here, and we want to accommodate them as well. One last question, to your opinion, and obviously your professional insight, what Elnet can do to promote the European involvement or the European, I would say, endorsement of the regional stabilization, and of course, with the recent developments with Iran and Hezbollah in the region?
Look, I think there are a number of things that Elnet can do. One, I would say, there is not a good understanding of the problem of precision-guided munitions that Iran is transferring to Hezbollah by way of Syria. I don't believe, by the way, I'm not sure that there's a good recognition of this in the United States, but I think that there needs to be more pressure placed on Iran and on the Lebanese government to remove these weapons. I know that France in particular, the EU more broadly, there's a lot of interest in trying to stabilize Lebanon right now and to provide it with cash and other assistance to help it get out of the political and economic crisis that it finds itself in. And believe me, this is a very, very severe crisis right now. For those who are not fully aware of what's happening in Lebanon, my assessment is that it is probably a country that is $120 billion in debt. This is a debt that no country can legitimately climb out of when it's 5 million people with no exports to speak of. And so there needs to be a trade, if you will, that if Europe is to help bail out Lebanon, that they need to really mitigate the power of Hezbollah. They need to remove Iranian missiles from the country and try to negotiate some kind of soft landing. I have not seen the Europeans do enough in this regard. And so this is, I would say, a significant challenge that awaits. The other thing that I'll just note is, look, I talked about some of the patrons of Hamas, and they were very obvious during the Gaza war. Specifically Iran, we saw its fingerprints everywhere. The idea that Europe should still be interested or eager to engage in returning to the Iran nuclear deal while not addressing the support of Iran to proxies like Hamas. This seems to me a glaring absence and one that really should be addressed. But by the way, it shouldn't end there. I mean, I know for a fact, of course, that Qatar invests significantly in European countries. If that is to continue, then there should be a restructuring of that relationship. Qatar should be forced to play a more positive role in curbing the violence of Hamas. I don't believe that it has. People turn a blind eye. They look away to all of the malign activity of Qatar in the Gaza Strip. And this is, of course, something that has been going on for the better part of a decade. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars invested that does not go to the people of Gaza, but rather goes to the government of Hamas. And the last thing that I'll point out is that you have a very problematic member of NATO, and that member is Turkey. Turkey remains a core supporter of Hamas. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, does not pretend otherwise. He is very clear about the support that he provides Hamas, whether it's allowing its operatives to fundraise on Turkish soil or even plan attacks. This is happening on a regular basis. There is a real virus inside of NATO right now. And this is very much something that I think that Elnet can tackle. I don't know how well this will be received. I know that Turkey is not exactly the most favorite country within NATO, but I think there is a lot more work to be done to put pressure on Ankara to halt this activity.
It's a very, very interesting point. And I can mention that on recent ambassadors tour that we did and took them to Hezbollah tunnels up north together with the IDF, we heard some ambassadors ask us, all right, but why are those Palestinians feel that closed in Lebanon? And we had to tell them, listen, Hezbollah is an outcome of a civil war in Lebanon. It's not Palestinian organization. And as we heard in the past weeks that Hamas also holds a stronghold in Lebanon, thanks to Turkey, by the way, exactly as you mentioned. Yes, we understand there is a lot of powers involved in the region, and obviously kind of injecting a lot of fuel into this conflict. And, you know, some people asked me last week, I was in a lecture, asked me, all right, if Israel will stop to exist, will Hezbollah will be done with it? Will be, you know, gave his arms? Obviously, the answer here, as you obviously mentioned, is no. And without further ado, first of all, Dr. Schanzer, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. We're not finished.